but I'm just going to briefly introduce myself and the format for this afternoon. I'm Kathie Pollard. I'm a policy officer at the Scottish Land Commission, and I'm joined this afternoon by Katherine Lakeman, who is Principal Policy Officer at SEPA and also the Chair for the Key Agencies Group, and Karlene Doherty, who is a Vacant Derelict Land Project Manager at the Development Trust Association Scotland. So the format for this afternoon is an hour's pre-record, listening to a variety of speakers discussing how they are bringing vacant derelict land into practice, followed by an opportunity to catch up and answer a few questions with Katherine and Karlene and pick up any interesting comments and observations from all of you. So without further ado, I'm going to get my team to press play. Thank you. Just to get things going, I thought I'd introduce the work of the Vacant Derelict Land Taskforce and where the recommendations had come from. So the Land Commission, together with SEPA, set up a Vacant Derelict Land Taskforce to strategically address vacancy and dereliction across Scotland, and it produced 13 recommendations in 2020 as a result of 30 or so organisations working together from the public, private and third sector. And the recommendations can be found on our website, together with a range of resources to help address some of the issues relating to the legacy of derelict land across Scotland, but also looking at ways to prevent new derelict land from being created. So with that in mind, I think we should just get going and hear from our panelists today. I won't introduce them all individually, but I will ask them to come forward and speak for about 5 minutes. Also just presenting their organisation, their role, and how they have delivered on the Vacant Derelict Land Taskforce recommendations. So, Karlene, could I please invite you? Thanks.
Absolutely, thanks, Kathie. So my name's Karlene Doherty. I'm the Vacant and Derelict Land Project Manager at DTAS Scotland. DTAS Scotland is an independent member-led organisation for the Development Trust movement in Scotland. We've got over 350 members across the country, and our fundamental role is to build the core capacity of organisations so that they have a solid foundation to then develop capacity, enterprise and opportunities within their own communities. We also run the Community Ownership Support Service, which supports communities to acquire assets, and the Community Shares Scotland programme, which provides an alternative funding stream for enterprising projects. What community-led regeneration means to our members is developing projects or initiatives that contribute to creating great places to live, work, do business and visit. In a nutshell, each of our members will identify local priorities as a community, then move towards delivering those priorities. And access to land and buildings is often fundamental to these projects, as is the look, feel and sense of pride in their community. Therefore, where there is vacant and derelict land available, our members often see clearly that the value in using these sites as a first preference rather than developing a new one, then deliver on several agendas. Before starting the Vacant and Derelict Land project, we knew that small stuck sites are often the most visible within communities and therefore can cause a disproportionate level of harm. We also knew that these stuck sites are often unattractive private investment opportunities and may not be top priorities for local authorities or national delivery agencies. But we did know that our members had ambitions to tackle vacant and derelict sites, but they often felt underprepared in terms of skills, confidence and capacity to tackle the issues that brownfield sites often have. And so to address this, DTAS and the Scottish Land Commission set up a partnership project to stimulate and support community-led regeneration of these sites, which are often very visible. The project directly ties into the Taskforce recommendations, which are focused on tackling the legacy. Recommendation 12 discusses the need for a green infrastructure investment fund, which focuses on bringing Scotland's stuck sites back into use in a way that contributes to a fair and green recovery. The recommendation provides 4 pillars of action that this work should be built around, and those are urban green spaces, community-led regeneration, low carbon housing and renewable energy. So the Vacant and Derelict Land Investment Programme has been created, and this responds to the recommendation to create a fund. And where the DTAS project fits in is supporting community-led projects to get to the point that they can access opportunities like the investment programme and then deliver those projects too. The project is a 2-year pilot and is now just over halfway through. There are 8 sites, mainly in central West Scotland, but there are also 2 in Fife and 1 in Dumfries and Galloway. And the sites range from high street gap sites to long-term vacant high street buildings and larger vacant areas of land within residential areas. All the sites have been proposed by the organisations and communities that work there. Live and work there. The impact of the support so far has assisted groups in establishing the feasibility of their projects and attracting funding to deliver meanwhile use projects and develop the phased development of their sites. All of the projects have had positive progress towards the land ownership or an agreement to use the site, and have gone on to make small-scale changes to improve the look and feel of the external environment whilst they're developing their long-term plans for the buildings. The impact that these actions have had for the residents that surround the sites has been transformative. Even very small interventions like opening up a site for a week for a free play event and mowing the grass so that it's possible to be used has really ignited the imagination of residents about what the site could become, and prompting their awareness that there is opportunity in vacant and derelict land, and it doesn't just have to be a closed off site that they avoid. Other sites have been transformed into community gardens where people are learning to grow their own food in a densely populated urban area. And another garden even got residents engaged in home growing during the pandemic, which reduced isolation and built interest in the site's opportunities in a creative way. The vision each group has for their site is dependent on their needs as a community. The ideas currently range from outdoor health and wellbeing venues to pop-up markets or community reuse hub. We even have one group looking to establish an urban renewable energy production site. From a community-led regeneration perspective, the Taskforce recommendations haven't as such changed our members' approach to reusing land and buildings. As I said at the start, our members have long seen the value of tackling these sites, but with the opportunity for additional support to get their projects off the ground, along with wider supportive policy, there has been a real step change in organisations who are actively seeking to tackle a local vacant and derelict site. And further to this, because there's been dedicated support for these types of projects, those who have decided to act have seen their projects progress much faster and be more informed as they develop.
Great, thanks very much, really interesting. Could I please ask Bobby to talk a little bit about the work that he's doing?
Hello everybody, I'm Bobby Sandeman. I'm the head of department of the QLTR. Our full name is the very fancy sounding Queen's and Lord Treasurer's Remembrancer. And basically what my job is the QLTR, who is my boss, who is also the head of the prosecution service in Scotland. He is the Crown's representative in Scotland for claiming ownerless property. And that extends to a whole load of interesting things, including land which is held by dissolved companies, treasure trove, and also where people die without leaving a will or having any traceable relatives. Now, we've been thinking a lot, particularly about what we can do with land. And before I get into that, I think just explain a little bit for the listeners about the constraints in our funding model, because that's very relevant to how the model that we're developing works. So we're a very small department. We're entirely self-funding. We're national in scope, so we deal with all the property in Scotland that becomes onerous, so we have power to claim it. And by that, what I mean is we have power. In Scots law, there's this concept called bona vacante, which is a fancy Latin term for ownerless goods, but it's an unusual right and it's only peculiar to the Crown. And the Crown has the right essentially to decide whether or not to claim property. And until we do that, we're not in ownership. So often we get referrals. We get about 150 to 200 cases a year of referrals of various things. And that can be from local authorities, from non-domestic rates teams to environmental departments, from referrals from other regulators, referrals by individuals, etc. And it's usually along similar lines of, we've identified this site, we think it may be ownerless, and what do we do about it? And we've been starting to think about how we can do something that's much more joined up. And we've been thinking about that for the last couple of years, how we do that better. The Constrainer funding model is essentially two things. One is a time limit, which is imposed by the Companies Act. So when we're dealing with property dissolved companies, the Companies Act very helpfully makes clear that when a company is struck off the register, the Crown can decide whether or not to deal with it. But unhelpfully, it then says we have 3 years once we become aware of something to decide what we're going to do with it. And if we're specifically asked if we're going to disclaim, it's then just a year. And what we found in practice is that certainly where community bodies are involved, or where other public sector bodies are involved, and indeed where the land is very problematic, that isn't enough time to deal with it properly. It's not enough time to get a plan in place often, and then we run up against the time limit. The second bit of this is that we don't have much money. So we've taken about £9 million a year, which sounds a lot, but then once we've paid our office and staffing and our costs of our advisors, we then pay the balance to Scottish Government, which is about £6 million a year. So we don't retain any capital ourselves, by about 3 million to meet claims. And we're not budgeted or funded to run or manage property. So that's the prologue. Act 2 of this trilogy is the Land Commission started looking at vacant and derelict land last year and produced a very helpful report about vacant and derelict land, making a number of recommendations. QLTR fed into that because we were very keen to see how we could help and what we could do. And essentially, our thinking is quite aligned with what the Land Commission is recommending. I think I've got the report up here on my other screen, and that essentially the sort of broad strategic priorities we completely agree with, that we need to have a joined up approach in thinking about how we deal with land, making good use of data and evidence to think, well, what can we do here? Trying to embed a sort of a socially responsible approach and think about how do we deliver the ambitions here. I think we all recognise that bringing land back into productive use in some shape or form is good for the community and good for the nation. So how do we do that? Well, we've been working on a model to try and navigate some of the constraints of our funding model. And what it essentially is that we will go out, when we become aware of a site, we will send out a team of our surveyors, and we will work with the local body, work with the local council involved to work out what the options are for it. Where there's a community interest, or where there's likely to be some sort of public benefit, or that may involve a community transfer, our proposal is that we will transfer that land to the public body at a significant discount to allow that public body, usually the local authority, to then go ahead and start dealing with the land with the community bodies. And I said, well, why would you do it that way, Bobby? Well, the reason we're doing it that way is it avoids this time limit in the Companies Act, and it allows a lot more breathing room for public bodies and the public sector generally to start thinking in a less compressed timescale about how we deal with land. The other advantage of it is that I'm a big fan of linking up and network effects. I think that it's something that we need to think very hard about and embed much more into public policy making. I'm pleased the Land Commission's recognising that about joined up. And the idea of networking effects is that the more people that are joined in a hub or network, the output of that network is significantly increased. And you'll see it in other spheres. So if we look at the growth of the internet, for example, and where there's a common interest in delivering a social value or public good, then we can all work. So the other aspect of this is that we're also looking at, as well as looking at how we deal with land, is what can we also be doing to try and stem the flow, turn off the taps, as the Land Commission puts it in its report, in the giant bath, to use their analogy of this increasing problem of vacant and derelict land. What we're doing there is we're exploring with Scottish Government next month and beyond, is how do we link up with the other agencies under a sort of common approach, so for example, a case conference or indeed a task force to tackle how can we unlock funding decisions faster for community groups and others. So if we've got a problematic site, and to give you some examples, we have things like quarries, we have harbours, we have landfill sites, we have shelvings, we also have other abandoned buildings, we have listed buildings that are needing lots of repairs. There's a lot of thoughts, brownfield sites, there's a lot of thinking about how do we approach that collectively, what funding can be unlocked, who is best within the public sector to help take that forward, and how do we facilitate that. And I'm very keen that we act as a hub there to help share learning and knowledge, and we're starting to work on that already. We've already started on this model. So this week we will complete the procurement exercise for our team of surveyors, and we hope to award that contract at the end of this month. I've already spoken to all of the Scottish local authority state teams about the proposal that we have got, and we're working with Scottish Government to look at some of the aspects, as for me as accountable officer, about what these discounts might, what discounts might be possible. My suggestion is that we would transfer essentially for community purposes to the other public body for almost nominal value, to allow the public body then to realise that they would get the benefit of funding directly rather than it going straight into back into the consolidated fund. So there's lots to do, and again, just to recap that we're very much on board with the Land Commission's proposals and suggestions. We're actively working on the pilot of this model already. Been working with some local authorities, including East Ayrshire. I know Carl's in the conversation today about a piece of land that's come up, which has been referred by our community body. So we're seeing how do we take that forward. And we're learning as we go, rather than trying to have an absolutely perfect model at the beginning and taking ages to deliver that. I think it's much better to start with this now and tweak and modernise as we go, and feed that learning into Scottish Government's land reform programme and share that with colleagues. Okay.
Great, thank you. That was really helpful. And what you're saying is, watch out, be more QLTR as we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
So that was seamless transition to Karl, actually, talking about East Ayrshire.
Thanks very much, Bobby, for that. My name is Karl Doroszenko. I'm the Development Planning and Regeneration Manager, as Bobby indicated there, with East Ayrshire Council. My role is quite an unusual one, because it combines policy development with actual implementation of policy and implementation of proposals. So we combine the development of policy, planning policy through the local development plan with the implementation of projects. And I think it's very, very important that the two sides work very closely together. Policy in particular, working with project officers, because then they begin to understand what's involved in a project, what's involved in developing the concept, bringing the funding package together, and actually doing something on site, and as well as monitoring the impact of the proposal. So they understand, therefore, better what's involved. And I think it's also important that project officers understand the policy context, because if they do understand that better, it makes it easier for them to justify their proposals and to put together a funding package. So I think it's very, very important, first of all, that project teams and policy teams work very much hand in hand, very much together in relation, and particularly with regard to derelict land, because I don't think, I think you're working with one hand behind your back if they don't work closely together. That's the first point I would make. Second thing I would make is that vacant and derelict land, each piece of land is unique, and I think Bobby may well agree to that. Each piece of land is unique, and therefore the solution to each piece of land is unique as well. Whilst you can learn from others, there's no doubt in my mind that the approach to and the solution to reusing vacant and derelict land depends on local circumstances and local variables. But it's an extremely complex set of variables and complex set of matters that need to be taken on board. And it's a matter of juggling these things and putting together proposals which are unique and specific to a particular area. So I just want to mention one or two other things in relation to the National Planning Framework as well, because I think the recommendations do make reference to that. And for example, the National Planning Framework should make the reuse of vacant and derelict land a priority. I would certainly support that, But I think the national planning framework must go beyond just putting together a set of fine words in support of the reuse of vacant and derelict land. They have to support it with funding as well. At the moment, vacant and derelict land funding is restricted to a handful of councils, and I don't think that's right. I think all councils have vacant and derelict land issues to actually tackle and to deal with. And it's not just a matter of the scale of vacant and derelict land, but it's the percentage of vacant and derelict, the perception within an area that needs to be taken on board. You know, you can have, in terms of scale, a lot less in a particular community, but the impact is far greater because the community is much smaller. So I think national planning framework should certainly give the reuse of vacant and derelict land, make it a priority, I should say, but it needs to back it, and the Scottish Government need to back it with appropriate funding consistently over many years. The next thing I would like to say as well, which comes up in relation to the recommendations, is the whole appraisal process. And I would very much support the proposal that it should be widened out from just being a purely financial appraisal in terms of the costs and benefits of reusing vacant derelict land. There is no doubt in my mind that as the study actually indicates, that well-being, for example, is a key consideration. If you live in a community which is run down or that has large tracts of vacant and derelict land, I know myself, I live in a community which has not got its challenges to seek in terms of economic growth and vitality, economic vitality. And there's no doubt that vacant and derelict land has an impact. I know myself that if you go into a community where these challenges are there and it's in front of you, it does impact upon your well-being. Communities do sometimes feel left behind. And so therefore, I think the appraisal process needs to be widened out from purely financial. It has to be widened out. And I very much support the proposals and the recommendations that we have in the actual study itself. Another thing I wanted to mention is the concentration of 20-minute neighbourhoods in NPF4 and the likelihood that that will be given priority. And again, I would very much support that because I think creating a neighbourhood on greenfield sites is much more challenging than creating neighbourhoods in more established areas, urban areas. And there's no doubt in my mind that vacant and derelict land does tend to concentrate much more within areas close to central parts of communities. And so therefore the concentration of creating 20-minute neighbourhoods ties in very nicely with the reuse or wanting to reuse vacant and derelict land. You know, in terms of our own approach within East Ayrshire, we've been looking at the whole issue of climate change. And one of the key things that we hit on pretty quickly in that whole process was that we wanted to minimize greenfield land release and concentrate on reusing land within more central areas of our communities. One, because that's the right thing to do, to reuse previously used land, but also two, because it is easier to create a cohesive community if you reuse land which was previously used within urban areas. Within East Ayrshire, we've been very fortunate in the sense that we've been preparing our next local development plan. I think we're one of only 3 councils in Scotland at the present time which are preparing a local development plan using existing procedures rather than the new 2019 Planning Act procedures. But we've been very fortunate that we've been able to work along with the key agency group, and they've helped us a great deal in putting together some ideas and solutions for various parts of the urban areas which are challenging because they do have large amounts of vacant and derelict land within them. And you know, I've got nothing but good works in terms of good words in relation to that proposal. You know, the key agency groups, particularly SEPA, have been working along with us. They are viewed probably as a regulatory body in many respects, but in the key agency group, they've been challenged to break out of that confine to actually work with us to find solutions to particular problems within our local area. And it's been refreshing to be able to work with them, and I hope they've found it refreshing being able to actually work with us. One of the key advantages of actually working with the key agency group is that they've been able to bring some expertise to the table which we do not have locally within the local community, within the local authority. But they've also, as a result of that, been able to bring and put on the table some new ideas and some different ways of looking at things as well. So that's been very, very refreshing. And I would recommend working along with key agency groups, the key agency group, if you have the opportunity to do that. Hopefully as well, they found it beneficial likewise. That's been a two-way process here, that they understand better some of the challenges that local authorities face when we are having to deal with, for example, vacant and derelict land, or creating or re-establishing communities within urban areas. So hopefully we've benefited, but hopefully the key agencies have benefited as well. So a few thoughts there in relation to the national planning framework and some of the activities that we have within East Ayrshire. Thanks, Kathie.
Thank you so much, Karl. That was really interesting, and I think I'd like to touch on the sort of health and wellbeing angle now with Ali, if that's okay.
Thank you, Kathie. I'm Ali MacDonald, and I'm an organisational lead within the Place team in Public Health Scotland. And my role involves healthy active environments, and that includes open spaces and transport and active travel. Public Health Scotland is a national NHS board which is set up to look after our health in terms of health protection, and that's been obviously most visible over the last 18 months in terms of the COVID outbreak. But we also have programmes around health improvement, and we have a directorate which looks at how we use data and intelligence to make sure that we work in a way that leads to greatest improvements in health and wellbeing, and also in reducing health inequalities. And we have public health priorities within Scotland that aren't just Public Health Scotland priorities, but are shared by all agencies across Scotland. One of those is around living in safe, healthy places and communities. But other priorities include mental wellbeing. We have early years, having a healthy economy, nutrition and physical activity, and also addressing unhealthy behaviours like use of drugs and alcohol. And actually, in some way or other, vacant and derelict land has a connection either positively or negatively to most of those priorities. Within Public Health Scotland ourselves, we have our own priorities, one of which is community and places, and I sit within the place team. But we have other priorities around mental wellbeing and poverty in children. And the reason for having these priorities and for having place and wellbeing as one of our key areas of work is because of the things that influence how healthy we are and for how long we remain healthy. And if we see vacant and derelict land in the context of the social determinants of health and health inequalities, we know that the environments into which we are born, that we're raised, educated, and that we live, work and play all contribute to these health outcomes. So vacant derelict land does have a direct impact on the health of those who live near it, but indirectly there is a lifelong connection on the broader determinants of our health, where power lies within our society, our ability to influence our environment and the wealth and the resources that we have access to. As Carol has already highlighted, we know through the work done by the Scottish Land Commission and Glasgow City Region that there is social patterning around vacant and derelict land. So almost a third of the Scottish population lives within 500 metres of a derelict site, but sadly that's much more likely to happen in areas that have been identified as experiencing higher levels of social deprivation, where it can be up to 50%. I think in urban areas within Glasgow City Region, about 50% of vacant derelict sites are located within the 20% most deprived data zones. And that's just simply neither just nor fair, that those communities that are experiencing greatest deprivation also experience the impacts of vacant and derelict land. If we consider vacant derelict land and its impact on the perception of communities and community safety, antisocial behaviour, environmental factors such as water and air quality, then actually addressing vacant derelict land can lead to improvements in health simply by that land being returned to some useful purpose. But there are opportunities to do a bit more than that and to ensure that the land is reused in a way that brings the greatest benefits to those communities. And I think that means a two-pronged approach. So strategically, things like the Spatial Investment Programme in Glasgow City Region and the commitment of local authorities, and Karl has obviously illustrated East Ayrshire, in tackling the challenge in vacant and derelict assets as part of their economic regeneration. It might seem a bit removed from health, but if we link back to the factors that determine our health and the gaps in health outcomes between and across communities, then actually access to good local jobs and having a thriving local economy is a major contributor to good health. So we do need that strategic approach. However, the connection with local communities is also essential, because our ability to influence within our lives is another of those things that determines our health, and it also determines those unequal outcomes that we experience. So involving communities in the decisions that affect them is crucial. And that means that we need a local place-based approach as well in terms of developing land, thinking about what the community benefits are and how you meet community needs. I think that's particularly relevant where you have clusters of vacant and derelict land. And again, that relates to some of what Carol referred to in relation to the 20-minute neighbourhood approach. Within Public Health Scotland and working with Scottish Government a few years ago, we developed a place standard, which is a tool for engagement with communities. And the 14 domains of the place standard are those factors that we have evidence that contribute to what a healthy place is. And more recently, Public Health Scotland have been working with Improvement Service and with health boards and other community organisations to develop place-based outcomes which are based on the domains of the place standard. And these have recently been published on the Improvement Service website. So if we can think about how vacant derelict land contributes to those outcomes, then again, you can see how vacant derelict land can contribute to community wellbeing and to improving health outcomes. And some of the areas that the place standard looks like are open spaces and active travel and places to play and green space, but it also looks about the sense of influence and ownership that exists within a community. And the whole place standard approach is underpinned by environmental benefits and sustainability and addressing health inequalities. The NHS also has a responsibility as an anchor organisation in terms of how the public sector can contribute to community wealth building. And anchor organisations have five pillars. That includes how we use our buildings and spaces to support communities, how we can purchase more locally and for social benefit, and how we can reduce our environmental impact. And so we need, as an NHS, to consider how we can make better use of vacant derelict land that's within our own estate for community benefit. We have done some work with Nature Scotland and Scottish Forestry over the last 10 years or so to develop demonstration projects across our estates that look at how you can use the NHS estate better for patients, staff, communities, for wellbeing as well as for sustainability and for biodiversity. One of the areas that was flagged up in the Vacant and Derelict Land Taskforce was about how you make better use of data. And I would argue that that needs to include consideration of local health outcomes and areas that experience higher health inequality, and how you can then use vacant derelict land to contribute to addressing those. For example, access to high quality green space is important for health. If we look at housing and access to private green space, we know that private and public green space provide different affordances for people. So could we use vacant derelict land differently in areas that have high concentration of housing without private green space to help meet some of those needs in a more creative way? Over the last 18 months or so, Public Health Scotland has led work involving a number of partners, including the Land Commission, Central Scotland Green Network, COSLA, Sustrans, Scottish Government, to look at the impact of COVID-19 and how we have accessed green space during the pandemic. We know already, as I've mentioned, the benefits of green space for physical and mental health, but repeatedly across a number of surveys in the last 18 months, we found that people talked most about the mental health benefits of being outdoors in green space, but we have also learned over that time that access and use of green space has been socially patterned during this time. So those who would benefit most from being out and about are also those who have been least likely to benefit. And that brings us back to some of the VDL task force recommendations about being socially responsible in the way that vacant derelict land is reused and how we can use local data to influence those decisions. So I suppose finally, whether we're using vacant derelict land to contribute to affordable housing, or whether it's around employment or green space or food production, or improving the natural environment through sustainable urban drainage or contributing to carbon capture, these will all contribute to improving health outcomes if they are done in the right way, but also if they are done in a way that meets local needs and contributes to community assets, they will also contribute to reducing health inequalities. And if we prioritise using the hard uses of VDL, we might miss some of those other opportunities for VDL to bring community benefits through additional community space and green space and contributing to active travel through green networks. So I think, just to conclude, there are huge opportunities through the way we reuse our vacant derelict land to contribute to improving health outcomes and reducing health inequalities. But that, I think, involves both working with and within communities, but also working in partnership with communities and with other organisations who can all bring different perspectives to how best to do that for the benefit of those local communities who experience the negative impacts of vacant derelict land most extremely. Okay, thanks, Kathie.
Fantastic, thanks, Ali. Yes, I think we could perhaps pick up on how we create a community-led approach in the discussion in a bit. Thanks very much. And Caroline, if you'd like to just let us know what you've been working on in the last year. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathie. Yeah, my name's Karlene Thornton. I work for SEPA, Scottish Environment Protection Agency. And yeah, when I was asked to do this, I was struggling to answer the question at first, not because we don't have lots of examples on how SEPA's delivering on these recommendations, but really finding it quite hard to pin it down to 4 or 5 salient points in 5 minutes. Brevity is not my strong point. But also because it feels like it's a bit of a moving feast in SEPA just now, and it's constantly evolving and it's gaining a lot of momentum, which is really encouraging. So there's a handful of people throughout SEPA that have been involved with the Scottish Land Commission's work pretty much from the outset. It's not just myself. I know that we've had colleagues in the key agencies group, and sort of working with Karl, and Karl, just to say, absolutely, I know from speaking to them that they're finding a really positive experience, and it's really rewarding. There are various other officers or colleagues working in innovation, looking at finance aspects, etc. And what I've found is that I've watched the awareness of vacant and derelict land sort of start filtering its way through the organisation. It's a bit like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but in a good way. And as people's awareness is raised, the ways in which we have opportunities to actually help deliver on the recommendations are becoming more and more apparent, and those are evolving. So that was just the first thing to say on it. What I've done is I've tried to sort of wrestle it down into 3 broad categories of ways we're responding and delivering, with a few specific examples just to add context. And the broad categories are probably at our sort of strategic organisational level in our operating plan. A big key one, and Bobby mentioned this in terms of networking effects, and as have everybody, through partnerships and collaborations with various organisations, and then through individual projects happening on the ground as well. And I'll go into a bit more detail on these, but I was going to say, if I was to plump for one key overarching way, I think that SEPA is helping and responding, one that runs through all of the categories. I'd say it's in terms of brokering connections between the people and the organisations that can make this stuff happen. We all know that for vacant and derelict land to be addressed successfully, you need a multidisciplinary approach. You need a broad range of expertise, all communicating around the table. And I think one of the advantages SEPA has is, as an environmental regulator, we routinely engage with and work in partnership with a really broad spectrum of public and private sector organisations who might have a stake in vacant and derelict land one way or another. So we can make those connections, and at quite a basic but important level, simply by putting people in touch with one another. And that sort of runs through most of the work that we do. So just to come back to sort of a strategic organisational level, I'd say that one's a little bit of a cheat for SEPA in some ways, in that our existing regulatory strategy of One Planet Prosperity aligned pretty well with a lot of the concepts around VDL and the recommendations that came from the Scottish Land Commission. We recognise already we're a society where we're constantly overusing our planet's resources in a way that's completely unsustainable. And one of SEPA's jobs is not just about regulatory compliance, it's about supporting circular economy, and it's about supporting Scottish businesses to recognise the benefits of embracing voluntary beyond compliance issues around the environment and, you know, so social benefits, etc. Also, our operating plan, the current operating plan, puts placemaking front and centre as an important aspect of our work. And as such, we're contributing to a number of placemaking projects, which inevitably include vacant and derelict land as well. On the sort of topic of collaboration and partnership working, we're working with a number of organisations, including obviously the Land Commission themselves, people like Green Action Trust, Scottish Wildlife Trust, the local authorities, Nature Scot, and many, many others to try and deliver on some of these recommendations. Just a couple of examples. One of them that I've been personally involved in is working with Kathie and others at the Land Commission and Green Action Trust on a project relating to a category of vacant and derelict land termed dusty sites. It's an acronym which I can never remember the proper acronym, but anyway, it's essentially sites that have been stuck on the register for 20 years or more. And the project involved collaborating with the local authorities, who I have to say were amazing, you know, and so we're making a big ask in terms of some of the information they were giving us. And we did that in order to try and interrogate and package and map data in relation to these sites. And as Karl pointed out, no site is the same. And what we're trying to do by gathering this data was to try and better understand the challenges or the blocking factors that were at these sites. Why had they been stuck for so long? And with the hope that if we sort of interrogate that data and have it in one place, it should inform innovative and alternative solutions to bringing that land back to beneficial use. So that's one of the collaborative projects we've been involved in. A further one that one of my colleagues, Louise Bond and others have been involved in is one with the Scottish Wildlife Trust and the Scottish Conservation Finance Initiative. That collaboration brings together its stakeholders, environmentalists, and most importantly, and comes back to the funding aspect, finance experts. And what they're doing is they're trying to work together to bridge the gap between the need for funding to protect and restore Scotland's natural capital with the level of funding available, which there. So yeah, bringing VDL back into uses that deliver for natural capital was identified as a key opportunity by that group. And with that in mind, there's work currently ongoing with the aim of developing and attracting innovative blended finance solutions that that would enable us to restore a portfolio of vacant and derelict land sites which will deliver for biodiversity outcomes. And that's a real, to me, it's been a learning curve for a lot of us, you know, this idea of green finance and how do you make money out of you know, sort of green end uses is a real sort of voodoo trick. So yes, I think it's been an amazing piece of work that my colleagues have been doing, just even getting to the point where we speak the same language as people in finance so that we can have those conversations. So that's just a couple of examples of collaborative projects that we've been working on with other organisations. There's a number of individual on the ground projects as well, where the opportunity to get involved in vacant and derelict land has been recognised. And the example I've chosen is actually because, despite the fact we're an environmental regulator, hopefully it shows we're not entirely tunnel vision when it comes to the environment. And we do sort of help broker opportunities that deliver on wider community well-being and social justice and the cohesion aspects. And the project I was going to talk about was one, actually, I think it's based in East Ayrshire, Karl. One of my colleagues has been working with Nestle. We have a sustainable growth agreement with Nestle, one of the many industry sectors we work with. And through working with them, SEPA became aware of a partnership project that they had with the social enterprise community shop. And they work on issues to do with food waste and redistribution. The enterprise provides members with food, those on the cusp of food poverty, but it provides vital access to deeply discounted food, but it also provides life-changing learning and development opportunities as well. And that timing when we became involved with that project had coincided with early conversations that colleagues in SEPA had been having with the Land Commission and others about vacant and derelict land. So what happened was we were able to bring that information and that learning to the group and subsequently help to broker discussions with the local authority and others on the opportunities for using vacant and derelict land as community shop sites, which was a really exciting thing to do. So that's just a few examples there. I don't know what I'm doing for time at the moment, Kathie.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's really excellent examples, and I think it's a perfect opportunity now to answer some questions. So thank you. Yeah, so we asked you all to prepare a few words and examples around how you're delivering against the Taskforce recommendations and how your approach has changed. And I think you've all done an excellent job at that. And I think we've got time just for a couple of questions, really, just to tease out some of the key issues, I think, and some of the things that we didn't really touch on too much. But I was really keen to understand how we can encourage a more community-led approach. So what do we need to do to bring communities into this? I was wondering, Karlene, is this an obvious place for you to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be honest, I was particularly interested what the other organisations, how they can see embedding a more community-led approach with their work. Community-led approach is everything that DTAS does in a lot of ways. I think that to enable communities to take forward these opportunities, there's different aspects of it. There's different models. There is the community taking ownership of a site and developing it, but that's the most obvious model. There is opportunities for communities to develop a business case around an idea to instigate development of a site that they think is a good idea, but they don't need to necessarily be the ones taking it forward. That there's all different sort of nuances, different ways that communities could lead. And obviously, communities don't need to, and it isn't their role to be leading on everything, but they should have a say in what's happening within their communities. So where there is one of the groups I'm working with, New Covenant Development Trust, they have developed a sort of preemptive to a local place plan. Karl may well know, but they went through the process of developing a regeneration plan and worked with the council for an evolution of this to then be adopted into planning policy, so that it's a consideration when applications are coming in for their areas. And that is a key way for the community's voice to be strengthened and what's appropriate for development in their area. So I think that's one avenue. But yeah, very interested to hear other people's plans and opinions.
Karl, would you like to come back on that, or was anyone else keen to respond to Karlene's question?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, what we have within East Ayrshire is a policy within the local development plan, which indicates that we will work with the local communities for them to prepare their own community-based action plans, so that we would assist them to bring them and bring the ideas together and prepare a strategy and a plan for the local areas. And what we've managed to do using the existing procedures is to enable the council to adopt those plans as part of the local development plan. And for example, the very first one that we did was in New Mills, and what we asked the community to do after we went through a very extensive community engagement exercise, and at the end of that we had what is termed a local action plan, a community action plan, and we asked the community to present it to our cabinet so that they would be able to approve it as a formal part of the local plan itself. And we went through the adoption process as supplementary guidance so that the actual plan, and it's not just now the first one, there are quite a number of them now which have been adopted by the council, and therefore have the backing, shall we say, of the local development plan itself. So it helps communities, therefore, if they are wanting to put funding packages together, that they can actually refer back to that, and they can refer back to the fact that the council has fully supported it. Up till now, the council has not changed the content of any community action plan, which I think is remarkable, in the sense that what we've been able to do, therefore, is fuse and combine a community development type process with a statutory planning process as well. So, and there are massive benefits to that, because we get the community involved in their communities themselves, particularly in how they can reuse vacant and derelict land. And it just helps them, and it helps us too, because I think communities bring a huge amount of knowledge to the table about particular and individual sites themselves. Sometimes, however, what communities lack is the knowledge that we have, some of the expertise that we have, or experience of putting together funding packages. So working together in partnership is far stronger than the council or communities working on their own.
Thanks, Karl. I was wondering if Ali and Bobby had a view on this as well. Ali, is there a health well-being angle that working with communities can bring out further?
Thanks, Kathie. Yes, absolutely. And if you look at the social determinants of health, I mean, I think I mentioned when I was speaking earlier, then the level of power and influence we have is one of the most important health and well-being. So actually, communities being engaged and involved and influencing what's happening on their doorstep is important in contributing to those longer term health outcomes, and actually also in helping to reduce health inequalities, because for very pragmatic reasons around things like time and resource, sometimes it's those communities that are most deprived that actually are least able to engage because they have so many other factors in their lives that are of a greater priority at the time. So providing that type of additional support in the long term to help communities, to help the community development approach is actually really important in terms of longer term health outcomes as well. And Public Health Scotland actually work quite closely with Scottish Community Development Centre, who have a lot of knowledge and experience in how to help support communities become, in the long term, more involved in their own community development approaches. And the other thing I mentioned when I was talking earlier was the place standard tool. And because we know it's an evidence-based tool with the 14 domains included in it, that we know are the things that you need within a place to help that place become a healthier place to live and a healthier environment. Using the place standard tool as a way to work with communities, to help communities work through where their priorities are and where they think their own community is strongest, or where they need sort of other resource put in, is a very helpful way that would inform thinking about where vacant and derelict land could contribute best to what the community needs are.
Thanks, Ali. Bobby, did you have any thoughts on that particular point?
I've got lots of thoughts on what everybody's been saying, so I'll talk about them in generalities. I was very struck with Karl mentioned local variables, and that's very relevant. Ali's talked about lots of health benefits. Karlene's talked about a lot of joining up here, and Karlene's been talking about a lot of initiatives. I think what I've been very struck with is we've been really starting to get into this ourselves, think about particularly where it's ownerless. There's another, and we've got the time limits, which adds another layer of complexity, is that there's a lot of complexity. There's sort of probably a number of think about like Spanish Inquisitions 1, 2, 3, and there'll be another thing. But there's certainly, there's certainly three broad things. There's the complexity here. There's a lot of different policy aims that we're trying to achieve. So climate change, health benefits, place-based economics, thinking about how do we get the best value out of a particular bit of land, particularly where there's cleanup costs or money to be thrown at it. The second bit is finance. I was very interested in what Caroline was talking about blended finance. And that's something I'm very interested in. My background before I came to government was in commercial deals, wheeling and dealing, and looking at various financing things there. So I'm dealt a lot with grant funding and agricultural funding in some of my earlier jobs. I think I think the real challenge for us all here is the opportunity for us all here is to look at how we as agencies can join up more and share all this knowledge, because there's a lot of really good work being done across all the agencies, a lot of really good thinking. The other bit I was struck about what I was hearing about communities finding it difficult. I was at the Scottish Government's Community Asset Transfer Conference a couple of weeks ago, and we had a presentation there from a very well organised community group that had bought a property and turned it into a sort of community hub. And they were two very intelligent, very enthusiastic, very educated people, but they said they'd found it hard. And I think we all find this area challenging. We're all been in the public sector for years. So I think there's something that we need to, certainly what I want to take away from this, and I'll be emailing you all after this call, is about what can we do more to join up and have a more coordinated approach in when we're looking at land. So in our case, when we've got a piece of ownerless property, what I'm wanting to do is we will send out our surveyors and start to prepare an initial set of options for local authorities and other public bodies for circulation. So here's some ideas. What do you all think? What funding can we unlock for this? And I think a version of that model would be helpful for other aspects, because certainly what we're finding with local authorities in their discussions already, the ones that we've started to do, is that money is a problem. So thinking creatively about how we help unlock funding for community bodies and others in the way that we actually approach things can be very relevant. For example, say we had a former shop that could be a community cafe. We could say to local authority, look, an option to think about here is that you take the ownership and you lease it to the community body, so they're not having to find all those capital costs to buy it. They could actually be buying, using some of their funding for operating it and having a different thing. And then you've got a degree of control over what's happening within it. So there's various ways to think creatively about delivering some of this, and a lot to be achieved. But I think we need to think collectively, and I think these seminars and sessions are very good, and the fact of having this conference is very encouraging, that we're all looking at, we're all agreeing there's a problem here, there's a benefit, there's lots of good to be done. How do we do it? And I think the first thing that we need to be doing more is making sure that we're talking to each other and having a hub or a case working group on problematic cases where all the great and the good are on that.
Thanks, Bobby. Karlene, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, things come back to you as you're listening to other people. That always happens, doesn't it? So I was just, when people were speaking, I was just thinking about what opportunities are out there at the minute, but actually how do they stunt communities potentially at the minute in coming forward to tackle vacant and derelict sites. And I think that, as Bobby was saying there about potentially allowing someone to lease a premises, an even shorter version of that is the opportunity for mean well uses. Across Scotland, there is sort of limited opportunity for mean well uses or a central hub to support communities or other organisations who want to use land. And I think that we could do more work in creating that opportunity. So outside Glasgow, there isn't a huge amount of opportunity for that. So that's one area that we're thinking of looking into to see how we can support that along with local authorities and whoever the landowner is. And secondly, at the minute, the Vacant and Derelict Land Investment Programme, which is fantastic and does focus on community-led developments, but at the minute, as far as I know, well, so communities can't bid in directly, they go through local authorities, which is fine, that's a gateway, but I haven't been aware of local authorities particularly being proactive and working with communities to develop applications so that they are truly community-led, and that is something I would absolutely like to see. It may be happening somewhere, and I'd be really pleased if it was, but I would like to see more of that. So yes, I just wanted to add those in because I think they're important.
Thanks, Karlene. I think that's a plug for our session on the Vacant Land Investment Programme, also taking place as part of these series of events. I think it was Karl and then Caroline, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to start wrapping up. Karl.
What I wanted to say is that, and it falls on what Bobby was actually saying, is that to actually achieve something on site takes a huge amount of resources, both community resources, council resources, organisational resources from others as well. And that's one of the key problems that we've got, I think, in a sense that sometimes we do underestimate what actually is involved to actually bring about the use of vacant and derelict land. Putting together proposals and ideas is all very well, but that's in many respects the easy bit. The more difficult bit is actually doing it, And if we are serious, and the Scottish Government is serious about actually tackling vacant and derelict land, we will definitely, as Bobby said, need to have a much more coordinated response, because one of the key lessons from working with the key agency groups is that, as I indicated, that we've got limited resources. So by working with the key agency group, we've added to our resources, and they've been putting their mind towards some of the issues that we need to actually face. So a much more coordinated approach is definitely needed to overcome some of the challenges that local authorities have because of limitations in terms of the resources that they have available. But I really do think that if you really do want to actually make headway with regard to vacant and derelict land, you can have the best ideas in the world, but unless you've got a team that is working along with local communities and others to actually implement that, nothing's really going to happen, or you're not going to make sufficient headway. So we really do need to look at that and how we can increase resources towards actually tackling this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Karl. And Caroline, you've got something to say on the one team approach, I imagine.
It was really just going back to Karlene's point just about the Scottish Government Vacant and Derelict Land Investment Panel, because I was lucky to be involved in that. And I have to say, Scottish Government did a fantastic job with setting the criteria for how you assessed bids for that. And obviously one of the main criteria was to do with community engagement and demonstrating that the project was properly community-led. And I think the thing that struck me from the last round was that obviously this has happened quite quickly, and I think a lot of the applications are very hurried. But I think it is that thing where I think you'll see that effect from the top down, because one of the things that came out of it was that people who had bid would get feedback, and a lot of that feedback in the terms of community-led stuff would be, we don't think you've engaged with the community enough. It's not enough to just put something that you think is good for the community and then do a survey where people are like, yeah, all right, sort of thing. That it has to be the other way around, and it has to be truly sort of integrated with the community needs and wants. And I think hopefully that will start filtering through in terms of sort of future applications. People will get that feedback and they'll start to realise that successful application does that from the outset. So it's just to make that point.
Yeah, great. And like I said, if we want to discuss the Vacant Land Investment Programme more and the criteria and how we can work together to really encourage it and support communities through that process too, then do come along and sign up to the session on that. There we go. Thanks very much to all our panellists there, and hopefully there's less flickering now as we have about 10 minutes or so to answer a few questions. And I'd like to invite Katherine Lakeman, Karlene, and if Karl's, I can see Karl, if Karl would like to join as well, you're also welcome to field out some of the questions. So just while folks start typing in some questions and comments, I was wondering, Katherine, do you have any responses to some of the things that were said there, particularly from a key agency's point of view, perhaps?
Yeah, thanks, Kathie. And yeah, really pleased to be here today, and some really interesting presentations there. As Karl was saying, the key agencies are trying to work much more collectively as a team to support place-based approaches to planning and also, you know, to wider place initiatives, including the vacant and derelict land work. And we're finding that there are several advantages of us working much more collectively together with other stakeholders and partners around this. And you know, it's really good to hear that Karl's feeling the benefits as well as you know, as a local authority. And not least is that when we work together, we quite often can turn what are quite complex problems into solutions, and find positive ways forward to something that previously might have been seen as quite a tricky sticking point. And that's particularly relevant, I think, for vacant or derelict land. And also there's opportunities to improve the outcomes on the ground when we work together because of that. And also it can help save money in the public purse. You know, if all the public agencies are working together with other public organisations, then we can quite often make, you know, get a bigger bang for our buck, if you like, and make money go further, both in terms of the amount of time that is spent trying to solve problems to actual delivery on the ground, because some of the agencies, you know, have quite substantial delivery funding as well, like Transport Scotland and Scottish Water, maybe a little lesser extent SEPA and Nature Scot, but we all have something. And if we can pull that together, then, you know, working together, then that makes total sense. Yeah, so that's, you know, that's what I wanted to say really. And you know, we're just starting to work in this way. We're still learning, and it's really good to get positive feedback from people like Karl. And we're very much open to working with other local authorities and other partners for other sites.
Thanks, sorry, having some troubles with my mute button there. Yeah, thanks very much, it's really interesting. And I suppose, is this an offer for local authorities to get in touch with the key agencies?
Yeah, sure, Kathie. I mean, we're willing to hear from other agencies who are interested in working with us in this way. You know, and so, yeah, if people want to get in touch with me, please do. Yeah, and we'll arrange to have a chat. That'd be brilliant.
Great, thanks. I noticed in the chat there were several comments, and one was from Graham Marshall regarding scale, and I suppose the issue that not all land that is labelled as vacant and derelict is actually harmful to communities. And I would agree, actually. I think that was one of the key parts of the recommendations, was around small sites that were either too small to be on the register, or sites that were not labelled as vacant and derelict, but were still having harmful effects on the local community. This is something that the Land Commission did research on, and actually one of the reasons why we recommended that the register should perhaps be looked at in more detail to include those types of sites. But there's also a tool that we produced to help gauge the levels of harm and impact on local communities regarding different sites. We just think they're problematic sites, not just vacant derelict land sites. And I think, Karlene, you've got experience of using that in practice, isn't that right? Being unmuted.
Yeah, I didn't have the approval to unmute myself there. Yes, absolutely. So I'm with each of the groups that I'm working with. We use the community impact tool that the Scottish Land Commission put together, and that tool it's a good way for groups to discuss a site in everyday language about how they feel about it, how safe they feel around it, how it impacts how they move around their area. Lots of different aspects, and the way we've used it in a few different ways. So it's been, with one group, it's been useful because they had several sites they were looking at and wanted to focus their energies on the one that was the most harmful, that made the most sense for them to then develop. And so they were able to evaluate the different sites using this tool to compare how they felt about the different sites. And it's also going to be useful because how do you measure, it's always a question how you measure how successful a project has been, what the impact has been. once vacant derelict land has been transformed. And so with each of the groups, we did it at the start, and once their projects have been put into action, we're going to ask the same questions and use that as a marker for how successful the project's been. So it's a useful tool. I'd recommend anyone to have a look on the website and think about using it as well.
Yeah, it's great to get that feedback, and also where it fits in the process. And I think alongside that tool and sort of the evidence that you collect, there's another resource that the Commission developed, which looked at assessing the wider benefits of land reuse. And I know, Karl, this is something I think we've spoken about before, is how do you measure the things that are perhaps not usually quantified, and where do you see that fit in the process? Is that potentially a helpful tool? I was wondering if that's something, Karl, you might be able to come back on.
I think it is a very helpful tool, but I think it still needs a lot more development. I think when we started looking at one or two cases locally, we found it really very, very difficult to try and actually put values against some of the headings there, you know. So I think it's a work in progress, but I think it's definitely going in the right direction. I think, as I indicated in my piece there, you know, the cost or benefits of a particular site or proposal should not just be purely assessed on the financial benefits arising from that. There has to be a much wider range of factors taken on board. But how you value that, I think that's where we're struggling a little bit, to be perfectly honest. And if you know, I think we need to look at the model in more detail. I think it's going in the right direction, but I think it still needs a little bit more work to enable others to actually, and even ourselves, to actually use it to the full, the model to the full. So I think it's going in the right direction, but I think more work is needed.
I suppose this is where the sort of collaborative approach comes in, and bringing together different data sets and as much information early on to help with that decision-making process. I wonder, Katherine, if you might have a few ideas on how that could be done in practice.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that we're looking at as key agencies as well, because obviously between us, we hold an awful lot of useful information, and what we've been doing so far is we're having very early conversations and trying to bring all of our data and information together as part of those early conversations to look at what's there already, what the existing commitments, where there might be challenges and constraints, where there might be opportunities coming along. And when we look at those all together as a whole range of agencies, 9, 10, 11 agencies together with the council together early on, that's when you can start joining the dots between everything. And it's a really valuable conversation. And we found that enormously rewarding, and that's where, the ideas for innovative approaches and, totally different ways of doing things can come from, in terms of, addressing the issues. And I think that's something that, probably happened when we were working with Karl and those early workshop we had around Kilmarnock. And, it's certainly something we've experienced working with other local authorities as well. We're also trying to bring together our collective kind of data sets on a bit more formal basis, if you like, through the digital planning programme, and we're doing some Pathfinder work with the Scottish Government around that as well. But I'd say that not all of the evidence is data. I think a really important part of the evidence is knowledge, what the community needs are, and all these things coming together. And if that can be brought together with all the kind of more scientific, if you like, knowledge from some of the key agencies, then I think that's really valuable. And if doing that early doors to find solutions, you can really kind of get win-win-win situations.
Thanks, Katherine. Karlene, is there anything you'd like to come back on in relation to that point?
I was just really pleased when recognised that there's a place for knowing what the true community needs are. And as I think Karl said in his presentation, no site is the same in terms of its issues, and no site is the same in terms of what the community truly needs and would benefit from. So that's all I would really add.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a few other points in relation to annual ground rent and taxation. As I've put in the chat, this is something the Land Commission is looking at the moment. We're looking at producing advice to government, looking at some short-term and longer-term recommendations. So please do watch this space. We're considering all options at the moment. But I think for the moment we've got a minute left. So all there's left to say from us is a big thank you to all our panelists. And I wish we had more time. This is the beginning of a conversation, so please do get in touch with the key agencies and Karlene and Karl if you have any questions, and email us if you had a question for Bobby. I know there was a question for the QLTR. But really delighted so many of you could join this afternoon, and thank you very much.